My name is Linzhen Wang, and I teach Chinese literature and film in the Department of East Asian Studies. I'm very pleased to welcome all of you to tonight's talk, which is the second event in our semester-long China Through the Lens film series, sponsored by the Yale of China, the Office of International Affairs, and the Department of East Asian Studies. I would like particularly to thank Professor Chongyi Tan in physics for courageously leading Brown's Yale of China effort this year, and for having made the Yale of China so far great success. I would also like to thank Shana Weinberg, the Yale of China coordinator, and Melina Pecker, program coordinator in East Asian Studies, for their great assistance with and remarkable commitment to this film series. It proves to be a real challenge introducing today's guest speaker, an extremely distinguished professor in Chinese art history and several other fields, and a renowned scholar who has published more than 50 books, articles, and book chapters. So here I shall just limit my introduction to his achievements in the field of Chinese cinema. Jerome Silbergeld is the P.Y. and Kinmay W. Tang Professor of Chinese Art History at Princeton University and the director of Princeton's Tang Center for East Asian Art. He was previously the chair of art history and director of the School of Art at University of Washington. He teaches, publishes, and curates exhibitions on topics in traditional and contemporary Chinese painting, architecture and gardens, cinema, and photography. Among 7 of his, I hope I'm right, it's a 7 authored book or 8, among 7 of his authored books, 3 are on Chinese cinema. Published in 1999, China into Film, Frames of Reference in Contemporary Chinese Cinema, is the first book to look at contemporary Chinese cinema from an art historical perspective, and to review the visual legacy of traditional arts and culture in Chinese cinema. The book also tackles critical issues such as the significance of gender roles, the strategies of filmmakers in coping with state censorship, and Chinese film's continuing attachment to melodrama. His second book, I know some of my students are excited, to hear the title. The second book on Chinese cinema, Hitchcock with Chinese Face, Cinematic Doubles, Oedipal Triangles, and China's Moral Voice, published in 2004. Sorry, I think I touched the... Received critical acclaim as one, quote, belonging to the absolute best scholarship in film studies, unquote. Hitchcock with a Chinese Face examines 3 recent award-winning films from Shanghai, Hong Kong, and Taipei, concerned with the issues of developing globalization and the defense of local culture, creating a new critical perspective on the complexity of life and art in China's rapidly modernizing culture, and on the universal themes of politics, psychology, and morality. In fact, the book is now on display at Brown's Bookstore. More recently, in 2008, Professor Silbergeld published Body in Question, Image and Illusion in 2 Chinese films by director Jiang Wen. This is the first book in English to study individual Chinese films in depth and explores 2 award-winning films by renowned director-actor Jiang Wen. In Body in Question, Professor Silbergeld uses cinema and photography, political history, anthropology and philosophy, Chinese rhetorical traditions, and the concepts of justice to examine the film's visual complexity and intellectual force, providing a unique look at the artistry and pressing concerns of Chinese cinema today. When I first invited Professor Silbergeld to give a talk here at Brown, I was hoping he would introduce to my students and the Brown audience some of his most brilliant ideas on certain linkages and interconnections between Chinese traditional visual arts and modern cinema, especially in terms of visual aesthetic styles. But Professor Silbergeld told me he had recently moved on to a new topic in Chinese cinema, namely Chinese film music. Film music constitutes another critical dimension of cinematic aesthetics, and Chinese film music plays a powerful role in presenting ideas and moving audiences. Although much has been written about Western film music, little scholarship has been produced on Chinese. So today, we are extremely delighted that Professor Silbergeld will deliver a talk on Chinese film music. For those who are interested in hearing Professor Silbergeld's view on visual aesthetics of Chinese cinema, please see his YouTube lecture on what is the Chinese motion in Chinese motion pictures. The title of today's talk is From Mountain Songs to Silvery Moonlight, some notes on music in Chinese cinema. Please join me in welcoming Professor Silbergeld.
Well, thank you all for coming. Thank you, Professor Wang. You did your research. And to those of you who are students or colleagues and counterparts of mine here in the audience, it's a pleasure to get together over this subject. And I want to say a little bit by way of background. Professor Wang and I are both contributing chapters to a book that I would like to say is going to come out in about a year's time, maybe a little less, we're not sure, but an anthology edited by Zhang Yingjin that will be produced in a long series of academic studies put together in that fashion by Blackwell's Publishing. And there are about 32 chapters in this book that map out the different approaches that have been taken to the study of Chinese cinema, mostly since about the mid-1980s when this field started to come alive. And I was invited to write on the relationship between film and the traditional arts of China, which I was happy to do and thought wouldn't be too hard a task, since in my 3 books, and I think I have 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 articles on the subject, it keeps coming up in bits and pieces, and I thought I would put those together. As it turns out, I wrote something that was exactly the opposite of what I set out to say, and that's always enjoyable. But I said to the editor, Professor Zhang Yingjin, who teaches at University of California at San Diego, and who's a good friend, you're missing something here. There's not a chapter on film music. And how can that be? And he said, well, there's nobody to do it. And I said, well, I know somebody who I think could do it. Nobody's published on the subject significantly, maybe not at all. But I named somebody, and he said, no, I don't like his work. And so I said, well, if he doesn't do it, then you have to do it. I'm sure you could do it. He said, well, I'll think about it. And then this last May, at the very beginning of May, as classes ended at Princeton, I gave him a call and I said, whatever happened to that chapter on film music that you were going to do? And he said, well, it's not going to be done, and besides, it's too late, because this is the 1st of May, and everything has to be turned in by the 5th. And so I said to him, what if I give you a chapter? And I must say, I'm not equipped to do this. I was raised on a piano. I don't know how to play the erhu or the suona. I don't know how to read Chinese musical notation, but you can't teach film without thinking about film music. It's there all the time, right in front of your face. If not staring you in the face, at least it's coming in your ears and making you think in certain kinds of ways. And so I said, give me 3 days. Let's see what happens. And so my intent was to take some of the little bits and pieces of stuff that I know, and see if they could somehow make something bigger than bits and pieces come together at least to represent the field and to get people to be aware that we should be starting to think in this very young field of ours about this particular dimension. And 3 days later, thanks to electronic mail, he had a copy on his desk, and a total of 5 days later, I had an edited version back in Princeton. And that's what this talk is all about. This is the first chance for me to present this in some fashion. And it's a little light compared to the things that I'm used to doing, but I hope that it makes some sense. It's not definitive by design or facility, but it is designed to sort of suggest a few things about the overall trajectory that film music has taken in Chinese cinema over 70 years' time. And finally, let me say that I will do something that I would never dare to do at Princeton, certainly not in front of my own students, and that is to read a lecture. So if you'll forgive that aspect of things, let's go with it. Few filmgoers fail to recognize the tug that film music has on us, setting the mood, warning or surprising us, cueing us as to how we might interpret a scene or perhaps just a given character. Much has been written about Western film music by those who turn images and music into words, but next to nothing has been published in the West about Chinese film music. Maybe nothing. I haven't discovered it if it has been. And I want to talk about this subject, but in doing so, I want to adopt a position that has been taken elsewhere by Oberlin professor Xiaozhuang Depman in her study on adaptations of literature to the screen, to the effect that any overarching theory is perhaps impossible, and at any rate less useful than the unique, detailed analysis that each artistic case, in this case, each film, affords to us. And she writes, since different combinations of factors can become decisive in almost every individual case of adaptation, I think it is a mistake to try to decide the matter in advance. I believe, a fortiori, that one cannot fix criteria in a general hierarchy. No abstract science for the study of Chinese adaptation is ever likely to form. And so I have adopted in this book an approach that is responsive, descriptive, and ex post facto rather than predictive, prescriptive, or a priori, unquote. Still, there is one overarching judgment that I would like to make of Chinese film music at the outset, namely, that while film music refers to both melody and lyrics, and while both of these have their importance, it is the use of lyrics that I believe is most distinctive about Chinese cinema, and this to a degree that I might say most serious Chinese films before the current decade could loosely be considered to be musicals because of the role that lyrics play in them. Generalizations other than this, and especially generalization intend to characterize any single distinctive application of melody as somehow being Chinese, stereotypically meaning slow-paced and contemplative themes for mostly solo instruments. This deteriorates before the endless diversity generated over a century of Chinese film production by their drawing on Chinese operatic, folk, and classical music sources, by their various sources of traditional and modern Chinese and Western styles, sometimes mixed beyond recognition, and by the complex interactions between diegetic music, meaning that heard by those characters within the film, and non-diegetic or exegetic uses of sound and music, meaning music in the background, heard only by the audience. Made when sound was still new to Chinese film, and before the advent of what I call genreification, meaning the separation of films according to theme, according to genre, and making sure that genres don't mix as was the case over a fair number of decades in film history. Street Angel, 1937, easily blended vaudeville and music, romance and politics, high tragedy and low comedy. At the beginning of the film, a variety show bursts upon the opening scene with a kind of battle of the bands, with Western and Taoist musicians performing at the same time on the streets of Shanghai in a cacophony representing the chaos of China in the midst of rapidly changing times. The musicians are part of a wedding march for a cross-eyed bride. And who wouldn't be cross-eyed trying to focus on this musical intersection? The male protagonist of the film, a trumpet player in the Western marching band there, catches a glimpse of the bride and goes cross-eyed himself right on the spot. So here's our first clip. His girlfriend, who is all smiles at first, is a musician as well. But the audience is soon shown, beneath that smile, a stepdaughter who was purchased by her parents as a virtual slave for what she can bring in as a cabaret singer, paired and compared throughout the film with her older sister, who is sent out to perform tricks as a street prostitute. Actress Zhou Xuan, who performed this famed role, rose from it to become the most famous Chinese singer of her generation, much like Edith Piaf in France, and equally tragic at the end. Here the film easily slips from weighty spoken narrative, which I'll show you a little bit of in this clip, with regard to the sister, into the musical language of dreams on the part of the younger sister. This is the mother and the older sister, who's just come home penniless from a night on the streets. And there's the young sister. And the birds introduce the music. And there's the trumpeter musician boyfriend who lives right across the alleyway. A little bit of vaudeville stuff. And now it's a quartet, two people and two birds. Now we can add an erhu. which turn out to be quite significant. Where the clapper player is, I'm not sure. The older sister has to take this in. Nobody will love her because she's a prostitute. And there's the wicked father. He wants nothing of love songs. I guess it's just a trio, just one bird, not two. The thrust of the film's narrative was for the boyfriend to come to grips with the older sister's prostitution, for which he despises her throughout most of the film. But when she sacrifices her life to help the young couple flee from the grip of the heartless parents, he recognizes at last that the sin of prostitution was not that of the sister, but of the corrupt society which thrust this fate upon her. Street Angel clarified and conjoined the professions of musical performance, acting, and prostitution, as they really were conjoined throughout most of Chinese history and much of European history, well into the 20th century, both in the public imagination and in fact. Later films featuring music, opera, and prostitution, like The Street Players and Farewell My Concubine, 1993, continued to explore this conjunction. Lust, Caution by Ang Lee, 2007, which reconstructs the time and place of Street Angel from a different social and narrative vantage point, makes direct contact with the earlier film in a critical scene in Shanghai's wartime red light district, where the female protagonist sings Zhou Xuan's signature song from Street Angel, The Wandering Songstress, which you just heard, which has a lingering fame in China, much like that of the song As Time Goes By from Casablanca. In Lust, Caution, the singer is a seductress and a would-be assassin, targeting a collaborationist master spy for the Japanese. And her song occurs at the very point at which these two adversaries acknowledge the prostitute-like roles that each of them have adopted. She in bed with him, he in bed with the Japanese. In Lust, Caution, the two are strung together by their enmity. Two spies, each trying to penetrate the other until one or the other is crushed. And for the young singer-actress spy in Lust, Caution, who significantly sings unaccompanied. This is a moment when lowering her guard to feel genuine affection for her rival helps to seal her fate. Typically, song appears as an occasional interlude in Chinese cinema, as the expression of emotion that erupts when necessary, and like the Greek chorus or the spoken Shakespearean aside, serves to guide the audience toward the meaning of the narrative in progress. This is an age-old tradition in Chinese culture, emotionally direct, yet allegorical in form, and rhetorically indirect. Going back to the combination of folk songs and court paeans anthologized in the Shijing, translated as the Book of Songs, the Classic of Poetry, or the Book of Odes, dating back to the 9th or 8th centuries BCE and reputedly edited by Confucius himself. The classic expression of this idea is given in the great preface to the Book of Odes. Quote, "When emotions are stirred within, they are given form as speech. When speaking about them is inadequate, then they are sighed as laments. When sighing them as laments is inadequate, then they are chanted as songs. Emotions are given sound, and when sounds are combined into compositions, these are called musical modes. The musical mode when the world is well ordered is tranquil, expressing pleasure, for the government is harmonious. The musical mode when the world is chaotic is resentful, expressing anger, for the government is wicked. The musical mode when the state is in ruins is mournful, expressing contemplation, for the people are in distress." Unquote. All that remains today are the lyrics of these songs, China's oldest, but not the original melodies. In the film Third Sister Liu, 1961, the authentic songstress of that name, who was born in the year 705, takes on a kind of proto-communist identity for the occasion, and in her initial appearance, she voices the rationale for the people's music, singing, "Whatever sentiment in the mind suppressed erupts like fire in songs from the breast. Mountain songs are like springs so clear, sung in valleys and jungles everywhere. They rush and roar like floods unfurled, breaking through the dikes, inundating the world. If songs are not sung, sorrow will spread." The beauty of this opening scene lies in the film's matching of these lyrics, phrases like floral fragrance at the foot of the mountains and so forth, with counterpart in cinematic imagery, as well as in the fine musical performance itself. The persecuted songstress makes it clear that when the people are oppressed, the music of the people will erupt in revolutionary song, and in the course of her music, she reveals the risks of singing too openly. This is a little bit hard to read the subtitles, but strain and you'll get it. What we learn from films like Yellow Earth, which we'll see more of later on, is how the government, today as long ago, will monitor popular songs to see how well it is faring among the people as a kind of polling process, and then will manipulate the results to convince the public that the party and the people are all doing quite well, thank you. It takes the words right out of their mouths and gives them back new ones. Han Saucy has written of the conversion of folk song to Confucian allegory, saying, quote, "Poetry tattles on society, a society formed in part by the canons of its poetry. The work of art, it seems, gets lost and found between its two functions of documenting mores and changing them," unquote. Many of the earliest Chinese-made films were staged performances, beginning with Dingjun Mountain in 1905, made from a section of a Beijing opera. The model films from the Cultural Revolution revived that tradition. Unlike most of later Chinese films, The White-Haired Girl, 1972, is a full-fledged musical. Jiang Qing, or Mao Zedong's wife's revolutionary balletic version of the traditional opera, staged during her reign as China's cultural czar in the Cultural Revolution. In it, the dancers do not sing or speak, but perform to the accompaniment of background music, as in a silent film. At this peak of China's determination to chart its own course, to go modern at a revolutionary pace, and overtake both the Soviet Union and America in its own terms, one might have expected something particularly nationalistic from a model film like this, something closely derived from Chinese opera and distinctively Chinese. But the music and dance here are a mixture of East and West, which proved particularly challenging in the isolationist phase of the Maoist era. This story of persecution and class conflict, of a peasant girl sold to her impoverished father's landlord as a slave and assaulted by him, then escaping to the mountain, reaches its pitch when she returns home, with her hair turned prematurely white, to gain her revenge in a peasant uprising. The landlord and his accountant are hauled off stage to be executed by the white-haired girl's boyfriend, which remains a man's job after all, and two shots ring out, beats from an orchestral drum, to announce the completion of the deed. This leads to a communist-style celebration, a kind of hallelujah chorus danced by a somewhat Doris Day-like heroine, the tune of Prokofiev-style Russian motherland music, which is then followed by a quasi-Tchaikovsky-esque Waltz of the Flowers, and concluded by Mao Zedong coming up over the hills in the form of a red rising sun. That's a lot to take in all at once, but here's a bit of it. There's the landlord and his accountant in black. There's the boyfriend with his weapon. And there are the gunshots. Long live Chairman Mao. That was the Prokofiev, and here comes the Tchaikovsky. And here comes Mao. Here comes I don't know what. Of this high Maoist style, Harold Schoenberg, the New York Times music critic, wrote in October 1973, quote, To Western eyes, the ballet is anything but revolutionary. It is a naive, innocent propaganda fairy tale, primarily stemming from Russian ballet, saturated with the dance vocabulary of the West. Once in a while, Chinese elements are introduced, native instruments, the pentatonic scale, and even a few microtones. But most Western listeners would classify the score of White-Haired Girl as movie music. Certainly, all the cliches are there. That tells you what Schoenberg thinks about movie music. Actually, he was writing from Shanghai about the live theatrical version, famously attended by President Richard Nixon and the First Lady in the company of Jiang Qing. But what he heard, nevertheless, was movie music, cliched, undistinguished, tawdry stuff. As for the White-Haired Girl dance troupe, which Schoenberg wrote of as, quote, rehearsed to a point where they could bear comparison with the Rockettes, it's all a little bit like ketchup on scrambled eggs, so of course Nixon himself loved it. Despite Jiang Qing's pretensions, the real revolution in Chinese cinema still lay ahead. Yellow Earth, directed in 1984 by Chen Kaige, which is often considered a turning point in Chinese film history, was originally conceived by its original author, Ke Lan, as a musical paean to the government and the people, to be set in a well-watered and flowery valley, with no reference to North China's parched and unyielding yellow earth. But the filmmakers, including the musical composer Zhao Jiping, overhauled Ke Lan's work step by step, and the songs became fewer and more sober each step of the way, like the film itself. The film's title followed a similar progress, evolving from Ke Lan's romantic Echo in the Deep Valley to Silent is the Ancient Plain, and finally to its present title, Yellow Earth, Huang Tu Di. Set in 1938, the story features an 8th Route Army soldier who gathers peasant tunes in the ancient style and rewrites them to have them sung as communist propaganda, a gentle form of ideological re-education. Yet the bitterness of the peasants' tunes seem gradually to penetrate the soldier's naive self-assurance. Toward the beginning of the film, at a wedding where the newlywed couple is too poor to afford auspicious servings of fish for the guests, in order to avoid its absence, they serve up reusable wooden fish laden with sauce, as the hired wedding singer chants in the local North Shanxi Xiantianyo style. Pairs of ivory chopsticks are all set out on the table. Of course, we know they are not. The sieved wine from the silver pot is poured with a golden ladle, which, of course, it is not. And this is all sung as if lyric fantasy could somehow replace reality. And maybe it can in some people's minds. But one of the unconvinced guests there informs the song gatherer he just sings bitter songs. Taking out his pen and notebook. They wonder what in the world he's up to.
真唱得好。
对着嘞，这和尚就是祖辈让穷气破了身，来到30大几还赢不下婆姨，光会唱个3曲儿。
鱼来啦！
来啦！
And here come the wooden fish.
是个木头的，摆着是个意思。
course. That's not really very funny. Although Yellow Earth, do I want to be there yet? Yes. Looking back in time, and to the impoverished rural landscape in place, leaned heavily upon the folk traditions for its music, it helped to open the door to a new and more liberated era in filmmaking, especially in what are regarded as art films. Army Nurse, by female director Kinmay in 1985, the same year, defined itself by focusing on a single pivotal scene. And that scene was defined musically by a creative interplay between diegetic sound and non-diegetic music. The narrative features a young woman packed off as a youth during the Cultural Revolution to serve at a remote military hospital. As the years go by, she grows up there, deprived of a normal childhood, of a private or romantic life, and wedded instead to her work. At one point, however, she is attracted to a handsome young soldier, a relationship forbidden to her, which leads her to refuse him medical attention at one point when his bandages need changing. But then she relents, and for one brief moment, just about 10 seconds only, she expresses her need and her longing by resting her head on his shoulder. It is the only love moment in the film, and the only one in her whole life. And for all her years of pent-up and suppressed desire, these few seconds must suffice. One can hardly imagine that film director Kinmay would not have given particular attention to the film music accompanying this brief instant, just as she has to the striking medium and tight close-up shots of the couple. And the musical solution was innovative for its time. In this scene, starting a little bit before this clip, a nearby repairman hammers away at a broken window, while outside an army bugle blows. Both of these diegetic sounds become part of the non-diegetic music as the young nurse yields to her personal longings and then reverts quickly back to the military discipline expected of her. The hammering, combined with and then transferred to percussive cellos, becomes the dramatic but threatening heartbeat of her desire. The call of a bugle, now internalized, draws her to her soldier, but also to the duty that disrupts her desire from becoming fulfilled. Massed rising strings express her romantic longing, then dissolve in quavering notes and a rising arpeggio of plucked harp strings, as if wakening from a dream. The audience may be left uncertain when these diegetic sounds ceased to be real and instead became part of her developing but ultimately undeveloped fantasy in her own brief period of disrepair. I previously historicized this scene, writing of it, quote, "Their physical encounter is brief, and so chaste it would scarcely qualify as a sexual encounter in America. But initiated by a girl, narrated by a woman, and representing a whole culture at that time so starved for personal affection, after 10 paranoid years of destroying all internal enemies, these brief 10 seconds when Army nurse touches military patient became one of the most emotionally charged moments in modern Chinese cinema." She's personalized. She's touched lots of bloody patients before, but not this one. Hear that tap tap? So far, that's just the repairman with his hammer.
小雨，快点！宋护士，你怎么才来啊？
哎呀，对不起，突然来了个老乡，他老婆难产，花样让我给耽误了。没事吧，小乔？
啊，没什么。
好了，我来。
Occasionally, the understanding of a film, or part of it, turns on an understanding of its music. And in the West, our understanding of Chinese folk music often falls short. The Day the Sun Turned Cold, directed by Yim Ho in 1994 out of Hong Kong, but set in China, for example, involves a family father who is being cuckolded by his wife, and who may, perhaps, later be murdered by her and her lover. The son claims to have been a circumstantial witness to this, but is he to be believed, or is he acting out some childhood fantasy? The melodic accompaniment for this film is appropriately tragic, bittersweet Schubertian chamber music without lyrics that reflects the son's love-hate relationship with his parents, slow and dolorous, modulating between major and minor in mode. This classicizing, westernized music, kept to the background, serves its purpose well, even in this rural setting where the villagers would never before have heard such music. And the composer modulates it well, low, slow, and grim at the worst of times, sweeter for nostalgic moments like this one, where the wife and her young lover-to-be gallop along with the jingle of horse bells while sleighing through the snow shortly after their first meeting. Sweet potatoes, hot sweet potatoes. There's a sweet potato pie for him. He's a lot more fun than the real father, a stern Confucian schoolteacher. Now a little bit of local music to go with the Western background. That was all a memory, being told to a police officer who investigates what might have been a murder. No less interesting is a wordless folk tune that leaps into the foreground in this film, diegetic but brief and probably unnoticed by most of the viewer listeners. As the father is first coming to realize his predicament, he finds himself in public practicing music with the villagers, rehearsing for a village celebration. Fellow townsmen have come to recognize the father's problem before he did and are now gossiping behind his back about it. At this moment, the wife and her lover are secretly trysting at the family home under the scrutinizing eye of the son, and the father has his suspicions. Surrounded by his fellow musicians, the father plays a brief tune of his own, a folk song of some kind, on the wailing double-reeded swana, while the camera zooms in slowly into a tight close-up of his sad, frowning face. The others listen, and one of them asks, "Mr. Guan, what was that tune?" The father replies, "What was that tune indeed?" There's Mr. Guan.
关先生，不是我愿多管闲事儿，那砍木头吧，老往你家去，这村里人闲话可多了。
哦，那是我让他去的。
He knows that's not quite true.
关先生，你吹的是啥曲牌啊？
是，我吹的这叫啥曲牌？
哎，那都不跳了，打鼓、打耍的。
Immediately afterwards, the father takes a performance break, dashing home, purportedly to get a new reed for his instrument, but mostly to surprise his wife there and confirm his suspicions. She's been busy with the woodcutter indeed, but he fails to arrive in time to catch her. Yet the villagers' question remains unanswered. They don't know the tune, and neither do we. This could go unnoticed, or it could raise a lingering curiosity. What does it tell us about what the father knows, or thinks he knows? Is it a tune of cuckoldry, or one of submission, or of revenge? Is it a clue to the father's recognizing his fate? What folk tune or opera might it have come from? Or did the filmmakers just make it up? I have yet to meet any ethnomusicologist or anyone who can identify this tune. If you know, let me know afterwards. Increasingly, in recent decades, as Chinese film music becomes ever more westernized, Western classical music has been used not only to establish mood melodically, but also to reference lyrical content and context that enriches the films in which they appear. The Western classics play an understated but telling role in the film Yi, directed by Edward Yang Dechang, in the year 2000, a study of generational patterns and the predictable phases of life. A particularly poignant moment in the film occurs at a concert performance of Beethoven's First Sonata for Piano and Cello, attended by the adolescent daughter Ting of the film's protagonist family during her first experiment in dating. As the two musical instruments first agree on the key, then join in sonority in the languid, romantic opening measures of Beethoven's second movement, the music raises the question of whether the young awkward couple will join hands or even become a real couple. What the audience will perhaps recognize is how the young man is simply dating Ting in order to arouse the jealousy of his longtime girlfriend, Li, who is Ting's next-door neighbor and a cellist herself. the filmmaker cueing the audience by this substitution of the cellist on stage for the cellist it already knows. Ting Ting is thinking about and stealing glances at her date while he's watching one cello player and thinking of the other. Ting Ting can hardly be oblivious to this, but cannot resist being drawn in deeper and deeper to the boy's own troubles. He will ultimately murder Li Li's lecherous teacher, who has been sleeping with Li Li's mother, and perhaps with Li Li as well. The structure of the duet on stage mirrors that of the scene and of the film as a whole, beginning tentatively, followed by gentle pairings, but then becoming less lyrical and ever more complicated. Is that the musicians on stage are being played, acted, by the director, Edward Yang, at the piano, and his wife, Peng Kai Li, an accomplished professional musician who recorded the piano music that Yang is performing because he doesn't know how to play the piano, while she actually accompanies him on the cello, or accompanying herself, as it were. For a film about role exchange, which this movie is, these transferred identities constitute a kind of filmmaker's inside joke, a play within their own play, entirely consistent with the nature of the film. Yang's own family was very much a part of this film about families, lodged there especially in his wife's music. Peng composed and performed much of the film's background music, including its opening theme, beginning by setting the key, as Beethoven's cello sonata did, but with a melody drawn from, well, maybe I shouldn't tell you yet what it comes from, but let you listen. Finding the key. Beethoven's Ode to Joy.
姐啊，这一切都要谢谢你跟姐夫啊。少来啊，你要靠你自己才是真的。现在轮到我们这家人了。哎，对，小孩呢？小朋友呢？那小孩呢？
Pardon my singing voice, but Ode to Joy, converted to this sort of tender ode to an unchangeable past and played here andante cantabile. The title itself, EE, or 1-1. is the Chinese equivalent of the 1 and a 2, with which the Western band leader begins a performance. It also stands for the way in which the film's family of 4 each goes off during the course of the film in their own way, one by one, to grasp the deeper meaning of their lives, only to return at the end, like Dorothy back to Kansas, with the realization that the meaning was there all along, lodged within the family. While music appears infrequently in EE, as often diegetic as not, nearly every presentation of it in the film merits deeper inspection. In the film, Ting Ting's father runs into his childhood sweetheart after 30 years apart. I guess I can go back and show you that moment, upper left. And when he departs from the family to re-examine things, he reunites with her in Japan to relive his past and to ponder how his life might have been had he not broken off their engagement. Soon after first meeting her again, there is a moment when he climbs into his car with a prospective Japanese partner, a Mr. Ota, whom he has also just met and who will become something of a muse to him throughout the later course of the film. As the father turns on the engine, the music system offers up Bellini's famous song, Vagaluna che in argenti, Wandering Moonlight, which dapples with silver. And Ota surprises him by whistling the melody, which then initiates a nostalgic conversation in broken English about music, and with a prefiguration of the reunion that will take place between the father and his ex-lover in Japan, just at the time when the daughter is at the concert on that first date, which you've now seen. The father contemplates.
The great Leonard.
Ah, you know music very, very well.
When I was a little boy, my family was very poor. Music make me believe life is beautiful.
My father listens to music every day, but I hate his music.
So?
When I was 15, I fell in love. Suddenly, all of his music means something. Then she left. The music stayed with me.
She didn't like music?
Many people think that music is useless. You cannot get any money from listening to music. She also thinks this way.
So she left you?
No. I decided to leave her. But, you know, I just met her a few days ago, after 30 years.
This must be her music. Oh, I can almost see her face, man.
You know music well.
A small part of that broken conversation, the father says, "My father listened to music every day, but I hated his music. Then, when I was 15, I fell in love. Suddenly, all of his music means something. But then she left. But the music stays with me." And Ota pronounces, "This must be her music. I can almost see her face now." Music here has become mood, characters, present situation, and future plot all in one. And while the film's characters can hear the music, it has also become much more than that which can be heard. How well can the Chinese audience hear and understand this heightened level of music engagement? And how well can we? I would like to say in conclusion, and in place of any summary or theorization, that what matters most is that music has now entered the Chinese language film at this level, where it can work in great sophistication at all levels, where it can express at least as much, and perhaps even more than the audience can quite grasp, at least on a first viewing. China's film music no longer springs from revolutionary necessity, but arises from global exchange. On a map, Beijing, Shanghai, or Taipei are even closer to Mascagni's or Bellini's Italy than they are to Hollywood, although today such distances hardly matter. The influence of Western music, Western film, Chinese music, and Chinese film now flow rapidly in all directions, and their mutual interaction offers ever more sophistication for the years to come in film production and audience education the whole world over. Thank you very much. These are just a few examples. There are so many more, and I hope that in looking at Chinese film, you'll take this kind of model to heart and think about what's really going on there. It can be very complicated and very enriching.
We're going to take some questions.
Because this is a campus, we take questions, if there are any. Yes, please.
I just have a simple question. You mentioned this interrelationship between the diegetic and the non-diegetic music, and how it became, I guess I got the sense it became a little more complex, or of directors were able to play with that a lot more later on.
It can happen.
I'm sorry?
It can happen. It doesn't always. Yeah.
But I was wondering at the moment of the silent film, whether there was also a play between diegetic and non-diegetic music, or what that relationship was like before, when you actually had a pianist playing for a film, for example.
Well, there's no actual diegetic music in silent film, but there may be the pretense of it.
Right, I guess that's what
Yeah. I don't know of any example offhand, but it's something to look for. How does that silent film music behave on occasion? You're suggesting as if they could hear it. I guess the possibility is there. I haven't noticed a case.
way of finding that out, understanding how the music that ostensibly the actors were listening to, for example, in the movie,
Right.
was figured differently from that, which was somehow atmospheric or something.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if
Well, the difficulty with trying to do that is that the movies didn't come usually equipped with their own exegetic soundtrack. Somebody is in the audience performing on a one-time basis, and we don't have, in any case that I know of with the Chinese music, any assurance of just what that music was. I know in Western cases that sometimes we do. That sometimes they played recordings that still survive and so forth. But for the most part, that linkage is broken. Once the performance is over, that's that. So it's hard to go back and figure that out.
I thought there might have been some sort of director's sort of instruction or something.
I don't know that it comes that way. I know that the films can be played to all kinds of different music on all kinds of different occasions, silent films, that is. And I remember, I'm not that old yet, but I did go to silent films. The first movie I ever remember seeing, was a silent film of Uncle Tom's Cabin that came with an organist. And it scared the dickens out of me when she was crossing the ice to some kind of tragic sounding stuff, and I had to be carried out crying by my parents. Could that be recovered? Was that the same music played every time? I don't think so, and so I think that the recovery of that is difficult. But I do know, as I said, there are some cases where we know what was performed on such and such, perhaps well-known occasion. Maggie?
What do you make of the ways in which music is used in Farewell My Concubine, or music is some part of the subject?
How to pull out just the musical aspects of that film.
I mean, it's very
everything about that movie is so tight. Is the Farewell, My Concubine, 1993, which is sort of, it's this 4 decades long look at how theater, which is a stand-in for movies in part, suffers and survives the onslaughts of politics and politicians. And there is interplay there between cinematography, visual art, the unrolling of a hand scroll at the same time that you scroll along all of the performers in one scene, where there is exegetic music and exegetic sounds, the role that they play, and you see the they of that, and you see the hand scroll that illustrates the scene that they will perform, and you hear the sounds of both music and warfare, supposedly coming from 2,000 years ago, right in their midst. I take that particular scene in class, and I play one of the last scenes of The Godfather, Part 1, where the consecration in the cathedral is taking place at the same time as the execution of 4 of the 5 other godfathers in the interplay of ritual implements, guns, and whatever the priest has. And you're watching people getting blasted to the sound of church music, and the sacredness and the sacrilegiousness of the whole thing, of this set of blood rituals that takes place in and out of the cathedral, is so brilliantly mixed that it takes this cheap novel and makes it into a great movie. That same kind of thing happens several times through in Farewell, My Concubine, and when I'm teaching, I say, now, there's nothing technically left undone. It's just a question of using it. But that doesn't quite answer your question with regard to music per se, which, of course, in the movie is mostly opera, and the interplay between the characters on stage who they perform and the question of whether there is a life off stage, because of the 2 main characters who play one of the great rivals for the throne of China after the fall of the First Dynasty, and his ever-loyal concubine. One of them believes that there is no differential. There is no gap between life on stage and life off. He is totally dedicated to the theater, in part because he was forced into it in order to mold him as, he's a young man, but to mold him as a female impersonator. It all becomes one to him, in contrast to his partner, who he falls in love with, but who does not reciprocate, who thinks, hey, there's a gap, you know? What we do on stage and what we do off are 2 different things. And so that, in a way, is the dynamic of the movie, and the way in which they perform with each other on stage. And one of them would like to continue the act off stage, and the other refuses, and so forth. All of that's tied in. So it's theater, but again, as music goes, I haven't really answered your question, and I'm saying to myself now, you know, I don't know the answer to that question. I'm going to have to go look at it in strictly melodic terms and see what happens. There is Western melody in the movie. Aside from the traditional opera that dominates, there is this sad set of stringed music that's always sort of downbeat, and somewhat ominous in character, like you think it's bad, there's more to come. But how those 2 interplay, I'm not quite sure. So we'll both go back and look. There's a movie that bears lots of rewatching. It doesn't get old. So, thank you. Other questions? Yes, please.
I'm in Professor Wong's class, and we recently watched a documentary on and they had a segment in it where they had a bunch of young people dancing to a newly revamped version of the tunes from The Red Attachment of Women and other period pieces. I was wondering, in present day, within the past decade or so, present day Chinese cinema, if there have been any new trend in either cinema music
Well, I suspect that your teacher can answer that question much better in the classroom than I can. I don't watch nearly as many films as somebody who writes as much as I do should. And for that very reason, I've said I'm not going to write anymore. But I said that before I wrote this. So I'm also a liar, an unreliable narrator. But if I were to identify any trend, I'd say it's the one that I do here, which is to say Western music is coming in, and Western opera is supplanting in a number of cases. And again, I'm not thinking about all of your 160 entertainment films that come out every year, but the really fine films that come out at the rate of one every year or two, and really make you stop and think and say, wow, that's really a fine piece of filmmaking. The one trend that I think is there is that they're bringing in Western music, and especially Western opera, because Western opera has its own narrative that can be drawn upon, and its own story. And the one thing that I cut out in order to fit within a time frame here was a section from a film called In the Heat of the Sun, really wonderful film. And the background music several times over comes from the intermezzo and then the prefatory music to Mascagni's opera Cavaliera Rusticana. And the narrative of that film is of that opera is strikingly parallel to the narrative of the film itself about love and love lost and love scorned, which I take to be about the relationship between the people and the party and the breach that emerges between the people and the party over time, so that the whole thing becomes allegory. And the ability to know enough about Western music, to know where to go to borrow something that fits. You don't just do that. You've got to have a real vocabulary at hand in order to have that sensibility. Or at least you've got to have a neighbor with that vocabulary. And I find that more and more frequently, I'm finding that that kind of usage illuminates contemporary Chinese movies and makes you realize that, like by Hitchcock with the Chinese face, these guys know their Western film, they know their Western music, they know their Western literature, they know their Western psychology, they know their Faulkner, their Freud. They're as smart as our good students are, and they're using it very well at the level of art film. If you go to entertainment film, it's pretty much the same the world over. They now write their own music, and it sounds like our own music, and it's all sort of obvious. It tells you whether you're supposed to be calm or excited, whether the excitement is headed your way or whether it's past, and anybody can do that. But to really grapple with some historical complexities and utilize things in this fashion takes some education. And the Chinese, the well-educated Chinese, are now really well-educated. And so are you. So go home and watch and think about what you see. And thank you very much for coming. Thank you.